Really excited for this topic about affordable housing as an economic development strategy. I'm really pleased today to have Bailey Hoppel Edelson with us. She's a longtime Navajo board member and our treasurer, and Bailey is a principal with Buchanan Partners. So she's going to frame the conversation for us. She has a lot of great thoughts about the importance of economic development messaging to all of our cases and causes to advocate for more affordable housing in our region. And then after Bailey speaks, we're going to hear from Chris McNamara. He is the Strategic Housing Officer for Economic Development with Virginia Housing. He's going to share the results from a report that Virginia Housing contracted to look at housing as this economic development strategy across the Commonwealth, but has some tips for how it can work best in Northern Virginia as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bailey, with principal with Buchanan Partners and our Navajo board member, to kind of give us some framing thoughts as we delve into the conversation. Thank you so much, Bailey, for being here.
Thank you, Jill. I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited, honestly, to have the conversation and hear what Chris has to say. I think this confluence of affordable housing and economic development is something that we've talked about at Navajo for a long time, and I think the business community, real estate community has sort of talked about. It feels like we're now sort of starting to gel in terms of that messaging, and hopefully that becomes more impactful. Because I think, the reality is we need more supply of housing at all levels, market rate, workforce, sort of truly dedicated, affordable. And it's going to take all of us at the table, I think, to hopefully come up with those solutions. So I'm excited that we're all having those conversations. And I think it really does support our regional competitiveness. When businesses are choosing where to locate, it's going to be hard for them to go somewhere where they can't pay their people enough to be able to afford to buy a house. And so they really do. There is a lot of alignment there. And I think, historic conversations have really kind of pitted those two goals against each other, economic development and affordable housing, when I think the reality is that they're very self-reinforcing. And so hopefully, we can look at different ways to kind of push all the levers that we have to increase supply, whether that's zoning, regulation, subsidy for AMI levels where it's needed, and as I said, kind of push supply across the board and improve affordability. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris. Excited to hear what he has to share.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris McNamara. I am with Virginia Housing. I work on our community outreach team. So Virginia Housing has always been involved with economic development, whether it's been directly or indirectly. We've taken a more direct route the past few years. The big turning point for us was Amazon HQ2. That was a huge deal. It was the first time a company really came to the state as the economic development department saying, what can we do for housing? What are we going to do for housing? Where are people going to live? What's our impact on housing going to be? So Virginia Housing finally got involved and was actually at the table with all those discussions from the beginning. And from there, we've kind of kept those conversations going. We've just monitored it, tried to keep up with changing trends in economic development, what's going different. And then the pandemic really, really escalated things. We saw some big changes in the markets. And we just really felt the need to have a better understanding of what housing's role is in economic development and what economic development's role is in housing. That is kind of the big thing that this report was focused on, was the relationship back and forth. Why it's not letting me switch. Okay, here we go. So yeah, just a quick overview. I'm going to give you a quick overview of Virginia Housing. So this report, the audience of this has primarily been the economic development community, and this group is a little bit different. So I'm going to run through a lot of this a little bit quicker, because you all know a lot of this data better than I do and than other audience has. But just a little bit about Virginia Housing, what we do, what the study was, what it wasn't, what we found, some statewide recommendations, some NOVA specific things, what we're doing already, and then just some next steps that we can really take. So as you all know, Virginia Housing, we've been around for a little over 50 years with the mission of helping Virginians attain quality, affordable housing. We do this through rental, home ownership, our community outreach division. We work directly with all the housing delivery network, which we are now seeing more and more and more being involved with EDAs and IDAs, economic development authorities, industrial development authorities across the Commonwealth, who are now seeing that they too play a role. And that was kind of this report really emphasized that for a lot of them. And we really do a lot of work to help with planning efforts around Virginia. So the economic impact of housing. So I know a lot of people submitted some questions ahead of time, and this was one that came up quite a bit, was how do we measure this? Housing obviously creates jobs. We have the temporary jobs from construction, and then the secondary jobs that come with this. If we have more people living in a region, we're going to need more teachers, firefighters, everybody. We're going to need all of those people to work together. And we've really worked to put our resources to really emphasize the need for public-private partnerships. We believe that working with the private sector and the public sector, we can really help as many people as possible. It's going to strengthen the economy, make Virginia a better place to live, work, and play. Creating a stable workforce. If people aren't as worried about how they're going to afford rent or their mortgage every month, they can focus more on their job and actually be a productive member of the workforce. So why has this report really been timely? So Governor Youngkin, when he took office, set a very ambitious goal of 400,000 new jobs and 10,000 new businesses during his 4-year term. This is almost 4 times as high as what a normal governor would do, a normal term, adding about 100,000 jobs during that time frame. So that's a lot of people. We've seen some tremendous growth and tremendous wins across Virginia. Your region, just in the past couple of years, I mean, CoStar Group last week announced they're moving from DC, Boeing expanding in the region, Amazon obviously has a huge presence. All of this is important. New jobs, no matter what their pay, high paying jobs, low paying jobs, they're all going to have an impact on the affordable housing market. If everyone is taking up these like naturally occurring affordable housing units, it's putting more of a pressure on those people that need those. That's their only option. So making sure that we're keeping all of that in consideration as these development deals are coming along is extremely important. And these are some big companies. We're not even talking about little or smaller ones, like a restaurant opening in your downtown or a small little coffee shop. Those employees all need a place to live as well. So we need to make sure that all of that is coming into consideration. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to these jobs are people. That is something that kind of gets lost in translation sometimes, I think. We see these big announcements that so-and-so is adding 1,000 jobs to this region, but that's 1,000 people. So if you're in a region like Northern Virginia that is constrained on where you're going to build additional housing, with given current restraints on zoning and permitting and everything, you have to start thinking about this and getting a little bit more creative. Had one economic development director who works out in the Shenandoah Valley region. He's worked at the local level, the state level, the regional level for over 30 years. And he has said for the first time in his 30-year career that people are starting to think about this. Where are my people actually going to go at the end of the day? They work 9 to 5, whatever their shift is. Where are they going at the end of the day? And how are they going to make sure that they can afford to commute to work, afford to actually go out and spend money in the community at the end of the day, and just keep all of that in, keep everybody in business, keep the economy moving. One question that did come up, I think a couple people submitted this, was about how Virginia has done with recovering since the pandemic. Virginia primarily has recovered and has seen job growth in most industries. I think the last one to reach pre-COVID levels was the hospitality industry. For obvious reasons, they obviously lost a lot of jobs during the pandemic and took a little bit of time to get back up. But we're seeing conferences, people traveling again. So that is definitely has recovered some. So keeping that in mind, that we've recovered and we're still starting to add more jobs, this is just becoming a bigger and bigger issue that needs to be addressed. So these next 3 slides are really what set the framework for this study. And I don't think anything on here is going to surprise anybody on this call. Current housing crisis, we can break this down very simply into 3 categories. High prices, Between 2020 and today, housing prices have jumped over 40% in most regions of the Commonwealth. That's enormous. Was on a call earlier this week with Chris Lloyd, who is a site consultant across the country, and they've done some research. The last time houses jumped this long, it took several decades, not 3 years. That's a giant jump and obviously something we need to be considering. High borrowing costs. We saw that interest rates were very low for a while, and a lot of people took great advantage of that and were able to get into mortgages that maybe they couldn't have before. And they're locked in at those rates, so that's awesome for them. But now rates are back up to where they more traditionally, historically have been. But that's keeping a lot of people from moving out of where they currently live, or first-time homebuyers coming into the market. And then also low supply. This is something that obviously we've seen going on for a long time. Population growth has vastly outweighed how fast we're building new units. So you can see here, the blue line here is your population growth since '81. And then the orange line is where new supply has been. Obviously, if we're not building enough supply to build up with to keep up with the population, we're going to have some issues. And if we're going to keep trying to add new jobs to the Commonwealth, that's more people bringing more households' needs, and we're going to need to do something to keep up with demand. So our goal with this study, we wanted to find a way to look at a group that traditionally does economic development work. Chmura Analytics is very, very involved and very well respected nationwide with the work they do on economic development work. They do a lot of economic impact studies, some feasibility studies, some strengths and weaknesses for different regions, helping them understand what type of industry they should be targeting, what role they play in all of that. So we wanted them to set out 3 real goals for them: to understand the role of housing in local and state economic development competitiveness. So how well we compete against our peer states, which Virginia primarily, for those unaware, competes against other states in the South. So everything, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, Maryland, DC, everywhere we're touching. So your region especially, you guys are Maryland, DC, New York, New England, trying to get those companies to come here. So I want to see how we did against those. Then we want to look at what other states are doing in other regions. This is something kind of a newer topic that everyone is talking about across the nation. How well economic development is integrated into housing work and vice versa. So we wanted to see, are there states that are doing this well? Are there regions within Virginia that are doing better than others? And then really to have a good, clear path of how we can align our goals together so that we can be on the same page when housers are talking to economic developers and vice versa, and try to really have a good understanding of how we can work together. These things, everyone on this call knows they go hand in hand, but they've kind of operated in these silos for years, and it's time for them really to start working a little bit better together. So to do the study, what Chmura did, they broke the state down by Go Virginia region. So there are 9 regions that break up the Commonwealth. And in each region, they did interviews, focus groups, primarily with economic development directors, workforce development directors, some community colleges, some local universities. It was not a housing study. This was not the goal of this. We've done housing studies. We know that there's a mass shortage across the Commonwealth in every region. We wanted to see what economic development was how they were looking at housing, what they thought the issues were. So some initial findings. Virginia, just going at the way things are naturally occurring, Virginia is expected in the next 9 years, 10 years from the time of the report was published, to add about 140,000 jobs. Housing affordability is going to play a key role in how well we're able to attract new companies and maintain the ones we have. That is one of the biggest parts of economic development that I think kind of goes unnoticed. We all hear about the big wins, the new companies coming, but the ones we have already, that is where economic development departments spend most of their time, is working with them to make sure that they have the resources to stay in business, expand when they can, and make sure that they have the workforce they can. Cost of living, obviously, housing is one of the biggest components of your cost of living expenses for everybody. And Virginia ranks number 12 in the country on the highest median home price value. So that obviously varies from region to region across Virginia. And you guys are obviously a little bit more expensive than most regions in Virginia. But it's important to keep in mind that when companies or these different rankings that come out, CNN, MSNBC, when they rank the top states for business, one of the reasons Virginia has dropped a little bit. We were number one in CNBC for a little bit. We dropped to, I think, 2 or 3 last year. And a big part of that is the cost of living. That is something that they're taking more and more consideration in, and companies pay attention to that when they're looking for places to relocate. So here are just some things that we heard from the economic development community. You can see the bottom quote there: housing and economic development are one and the same. So to hear that from some of these economic developers is encouraging for me, for what I do. I spend most of my time interacting with them and working with them. They see it as important for retaining and attracting workforce, making sure that there is a steady stream of housing close to where these sites and buildings are. Make sure that communities have some kind of plan. They plan for sites for years and years and years. There's some large sites in the state that Virginia has been investing in for over a decade, but they haven't really thought about housing, and now they are starting to. So this is something that we've seen some change happening, and it's very, very encouraging. And then when they're getting RFPs from companies, requests for proposals, so say Amazon's looking for where to put something, they will send out an RFP. They're asking about housing now. That is something that is very new and not something that we've seen historically. I used to work for economic development for the state, and that was never a question. And I left there only 3 years ago. So that's a huge, huge difference. And when we saw housing, it was kind of an afterthought, but it is something that has changed a lot recently. So just looking at some of the common threads across the Commonwealth, these are things that we know. These are what is keeping housing from increasing supply across Virginia. Unavailable resources. There's just not enough land. Especially during COVID, we had issues getting material, increase of labor costs, lack of labor, regulations, zonings, permitting, infrastructure. This is especially in more of the rural regions where some of them don't even have broadband at this point. They're still working on that. We've got really great efforts led by DHCD to try to increase that. And then NIMBYism. Everyone on this call knows about that. But it's kind of funny to hear economic development people talk about it when they get a project. Theirs is very different. So they'll have a large distribution center. People will complain about the traffic for it. It's kind of the same things, just at different levels. Like a new apartment complex, people might complain about the traffic, that all these new cars. A new distribution center, it's, oh, we don't want all those trucks. So it's kind of funny to hear just that this same thing is happening across the board, just at different levels. So now just a couple things, just Northern Virginia specific. So I will, at the end, I'll put this in the chat, a link to the whole report. There are a couple pages for every Go Virginia region. These are just a couple quotes from economic development directors in your region, from 2 of the counties up there. Every one of them, everybody who participated in these focus groups said that housing is a big concern when they're doing their work. Every one of them, no matter what projects they're working on, housing is coming up. People are more and more concerned in the urban areas like Northern Virginia about congestion and how that's going to impact. People aren't going to drive 60 miles, which is very common in, say, Southwest Virginia, where 60 miles is 60 minutes. Northern Virginia, driving 60 miles could take you days. I remember living up there. So it's very, very different, and people are thinking about things a little bit differently. These were the 3 biggest barriers. I saw them, you saw them, we talked about them a minute ago. High costs, permitting, infrastructure, nothing new here. These are same issues that are being faced across Virginia. Northern Virginia is no different. People are complaining about how long it takes to get a permit, what the process is, what the review process is, what the cost is of getting labor to Northern Virginia, because that was something we were hearing, is that a lot of these people are having to bring in the labor force to do the construction. So they're paying to have them stay in a hotel for a couple months. That cost gets passed on to the end user. And then infrastructure. There are parts of Northern Virginia where infrastructure is kind of tapped out. So what are we going to do? How are we going to reuse some of these old buildings? How are we going to reuse, adaptive reuse? If we have to knock down some things and rebuild, what is the best use for the existing infrastructure to make sure that we can bring as much housing as possible? And then we kind of asked this region specifically, this was a question that was brought up for everybody, but what are some things that the economic development community sees as good tools? Public-private partnerships, that was one that was really brought up across the board. And they brought up the Washington Conservancy Fund, which is a corporate investment fund, for those of you who don't know, that makes low-interest loans to affordable housing developers to help kind of offset some of this, make sure that housing is going where it's needed. A regional approach and discussion. You guys have a great group in Navajo and some other nonprofits up there that are working at this regional level. Economic development in that region has, I will say, prior to Amazon HQ2, they kind of worked in their own individual silos. It was Fairfax, Prince William, Arlington, Alexandria. People don't care where the company is. They're going to live in one and work in the other. It's not uncommon. That's very, very, very common up there. So to not have a regional approach and have these discussions is just kind of silly, honestly. And then mixed use developments. There's plenty of examples of mixed use development in Northern Virginia and across Virginia, but including workforce housing. So Virginia Housing, we have a great financing program to do this mixed use, mixed income, where we're making sure that there is some affordable housing included, specifically for the workforce, looking at that like 80% AMI, just to make sure that there are options up there. And these are things that we're adding that live, work, play, make sure everything's as close as possible. And then development on surplus government land. This is one that came up again, pretty much every region. You guys have some pretty good examples in Fairfax. They have the government center where they did some additional housing on some excess land there. So it's a good chance for the localities to really get involved and knock off some of those costs from the beginning. If they have land that they own that they're willing to gift to a developer or sell at a very discounted rate, these are all good ways for them to help bring more housing stock and reduce some of those barriers. So this is just kind of summary of some of the different to show that no region was the same. There was a question about how other parts of the state are addressing housing. Topography, not too much of a concern in Northern Virginia, but when we get out along the 81 corridor in Southwest Virginia, and then as we get towards the coast, they're dealing with different things. Aging infrastructure and housing stock. This is one that did come up several times for the Northern Virginia group. South side, Southwest, they really saw this a lot more, but it was kind of interesting to see that the same issues that Southwest Virginia is facing, where they have housing stock that maybe it's affordable, but it's very old and needs a lot of upgrades to make it appealing and livable for the current workforce. Some parts of Northern Virginia reported seeing the same things. And then the high growth areas, seeing commute times, people are driving farther and farther away. If they're only have to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, they are seeing that people are willing to commute a little bit farther. If you only have to do that drive a couple times, why not live a little bit farther out and get something that is more affordable? But when that happens, it's putting pressure on some of these more rural areas. So Go Virginia Region 6 is kind of covers the Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula. So they have seen extreme price increases over the past few years from people moving out of DC, Northern Virginia, down to that region and taking up the limited housing stock they have. So building there is very, very difficult because they don't have the infrastructure. There's no water lines going to a lot of these places. There's no electric still needs to be added to some of them. Broadband's not available. So these are all things that need to be considered. Like, it sounds great, like, oh, they can just move out a little bit farther, but then that's impacting that part of the state. Same thing going out towards Winchester. You have people that are moving out that way, out towards Warrenton. So people just moving away is not the answer. So it needs to be really a holistic approach to this, thinking about if we're going to put a job center in Fairfax, is there enough housing for people there? So obviously, Virginia is not the only one facing this problem. It's being felt all across the country. I mentioned this earlier, but it is being included more and more and more in housing, in economic development RFPs. Companies, when they come and they're touring a site or touring a building, they want to see physical places where their employees can live. Where can they afford to live? So bringing in housing and having them involved is extremely important. So just a couple quick examples. We wanted to see if anyone had a good housing strategy included in their economic development plan. And the answer was no. Nobody really had it. It's mentioned that it's important, it plays a key role, but no one really has a real plan. Ohio, they have a goal of, for every new job they announce, 1 new housing permit. It's very ambitious. Georgia, Connecticut, Nebraska, North Carolina, they're doing some efforts on workforce development and rural housing, making sure that these rural areas and some revitalization efforts are really tied into where they're seeing economic development. Rezoning efforts, different places are coming at this in different ways, adding ADUs into permissible use by right. Atlanta, they're coming in with some ideas of how to expedite permitting and increase density. And then we're seeing some creative ideas with financing where private sectors are coming involved. Okay, so we'll just go to the end here. This is an example of Microsoft. They got involved with housing where instead of having so you have your traditional structure, just for easy math, 75% financing required. They're coming in and offering financing at a much, much lower interest rate to help reduce some of the debt that a developer has to take on and some of the risk. So they saw the need that for more housing for their employees and for the communities they lived in, where they were located. So it's not just for Microsoft employees. They want to be good social, looking out for the well-being of the whole community that they're working in. So this is a good example of how a company can do this. Obviously, not every company can come in and offer financing like this. But what we are seeing, we talked about the Conservancy Fund earlier, is some groups coming together, maybe 5 or 6 different companies working together to be able to pool their funds, pool their resources, and offer that financing. So this is a great opportunity to really, for the housing network, to tap into the economic development network. Economic developers, they know their companies. They visit them regularly. They know them. They're hearing them that they have issues with housing. So this is a good way for them to be able to say, hey, here's a good way for you to actually do something about it. So Apple, out in California, they were seeing a huge need for assistance for first-time homebuyers. So they actually donated money directly to California's Housing Finance Agency. They donated about $16 million to help with down payment assistance. So you can see it only averaged about $622 per household. They helped about 2,500 households, but that adds up. You add that with any other resources that are out there, and that's huge. This is really great for, like you can see here, teachers, veterans, firefighters. They made up a good chunk of those households that they helped out. Now the important part, how are we going to do this? What are we going to actually do? So Chmura came back with a couple recommendations for us. Basically that everyone needs to start talking to each other is kind of how to sum this up in one simple phrase. There are a lot of barriers and they need to be reduced. This is something you're hearing over and over again. General Assembly is addressing some of this or attempting to, but a lot of this falls at the local level, making sure that zoning is updated. There are some places that have some outdated minimum lot size requirements for the entire counties and cities that just don't make sense anymore. Or there's new technology, there's manufactured housing has taken on brand new, like extremely different than what traditionally has been seen. Need to think of a way to really increase participation in the workforce, the construction workforce. That was something during COVID, those numbers dropped drastically. People that were enrolling in these programs, basically an entire generation of construction workers has been lost between 2008, when people got out of the industry due to the housing crisis, and then With COVID, those numbers just went even further. Thinking of new ways to develop financing options, trying to get a little creative, working with these private companies, anything we can do to lower the cost of regulation. This is nothing new to any of you at all. And then the big thing they came back with us for was at every level, the local, regional, statewide, that housing needs to be included in all economic development goals, and the other way around. Economic development needs to be brought up into our housing goals. If we're coming up with these housing plans and we're not taking into consideration that your neighbor down the hall is working in economic development, is working on trying to attract this company that's going to bring 2,000 new jobs, your plan is already outdated. So making sure that everyone is aware and involved in these conversations is huge. People, like I said, brought up the question about NIMBYism a lot, and this is one way to really try to work to address this, making sure that you're on the same page, everyone's working towards these same goals and has the same understanding. Just being at the table together from the start is huge and makes a big difference. We are starting to see more and more economic development departments reach out to us proactively saying, we're losing out on jobs. Our companies are struggling to stay open. Nobody's expanding. They can't keep a workforce. What can we do? How can we address this? Taking the regional approach. Talked about this. I mean, this is obviously Southern Virginia, Danville. Danville's a small city that has seen a lot of growth in the past few years, but they can't address their needs by themselves. They've got a casino that's put a huge impact on their housing market. They have one of the largest industrial sites on the East Coast that is ready to go for a company that could attract several thousand jobs. And if that happens, the city can't fix that housing problem by itself. It's going to take a regional approach. And it's the same thing in Northern Virginia. Expecting Arlington to address the housing needs by themselves is just not realistic. It's going to be a regional approach to anything. Encouraging public-private partnerships and promoting Virginia as a leader in innovation. Innovation and public-private partnerships can go hand in hand. We just talked about those two examples with Apple and Microsoft earlier. Those are great public-private partnerships at kind of a large-scale level, but any little thing can help. Companies are being more and more creative with this. We were seeing some companies starting to add as a hiring incentive, a down payment assistance program. Stay with us for 5 years. It's a grant that's forgiven. It's a lot cheaper for them to give that money to an employee and keep them there than to have to market, hire, retrain somebody new, and just understanding that. And then promoting innovation, trying to think of new ways. This is something that goes without saying, like, there's new technology out there. There's new ways of doing things. Having to think outside the box is something that the economic development community does very well. The housing community does very well, but having them at the same page, thinking about what they could come up with together is huge. There was a couple questions about, should we even be doing any of this if we're on the, we're about to enter a recession or the economy is about to tank. And I think, in my opinion, this was not the Chmura report. This is no one else. This is my opinion, 100%. Absolutely. If we already have people that are struggling to pay their rent or pay their mortgage, and inflation keeps going up and costs are getting more and more expensive, people are going to risk losing their homes. People are going to risk having to go out and not have to give up something else, not pay their medical bills, not pay food. It's just makes it even more important to try to be creative here. So Virginia Housing, we haven't just been sitting around. I do want to acknowledge that we've done quite a bit already. We've been working hard on this, and all of you have as well. So just a couple different things. We have been having very, very active conversations with our partners at VEDP and DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Economic Development Partnership. We're meeting with them regularly to talk about this, try to understand how we can work together, make sure that we're aware of what one another are doing. When the state's investing in a site, are we also investing in housing nearby? Is this something that we're just going to wait until a company announces and then keep doing what we've been doing? No, we need to move to start being more proactive. We've been sponsoring and participating in these housing summits. I know you guys have one coming up soon in Northern Virginia. We've been doing these all over the Commonwealth, and they've been a really good opportunity. And then with the regionalism, this is something I think most of you are probably aware. We gave a grant to all the planning district commissions a couple of years ago. This was a great model to get that group that traditionally haven't done much housing for the most part to start thinking about housing and how they can get involved and what they could do. And we've just seen some great results from that and hoping to keep that one going, keep those conversations happening. Some other things we've done, we're looking at some reworking of the qualified allocation plan for our LIHTC program, fast tracking production, looking at how we can use the state housing opportunity tax credit to really focus on new production and making sure that that is going to regions that have the higher need. And then I mentioned this earlier, our mixed use, mixed income program. So that's a really good understanding, a good chance to bring together both market rate housing, affordable housing, retail, commercial space, just using that as a tool. And that's maybe something that economic development community gets a little bit more behind because it has a business side to it. And that also opens up some other different funding sources that maybe can only do the mixed use side of things, not the residential. Maybe they can access a couple funding things that maybe traditional housing can't. So just trying to get creative with things like that. For those of you not aware, we just kind of overhauled our first-time homebuyer program and our mortgages to make sure that we're reaching an even greater population. If you haven't looked, make sure you're checking out our income limits and our sales prices. This is something on here. We've got the living environment pillar. That is something that VDP really led the charge on at the governor's request to look at a all of government approach to how do we make Virginia the best place to live, work, and play. So we participated in that, and a big part of it was increasing our sales price limits and income limits to make sure that we're really targeting that workforce and making sure that anyone who qualifies is able to get into a home. And then we are really working hard to do outreach directly to employers to make sure that they're aware of all these different resources. It's amazing how many times we go in and they just say, "Oh, Virginia housing, we don't know, like whatever. You guys only do low-income housing tax credit. You're those people, whatever. That's not our employees." But then we start talking numbers and they realize, "Oh, wow, there's a lot out there." And then we're able to share the different resources that some of you and your groups have as well to make sure that people just are aware. It's a big education curve. And then innovation, this was one that came up big in conversation. I do want to make everyone aware that Virginia Housing has our innovation grant. In the past, this has been something we've done, just the innovative construction, where we funded things like 3D printed housing, advanced next generation manufactured housing, looking at modular. This year, we've kind of revamped the program completely. We've got 3 different buckets: an innovative planning grant, which is $50,000 to look at some kind of new idea or service, try to figure out what you would need to be doing for that. That one's up to $50,000. Innovative services programs, how you can work with your residents, your community to provide a service or a program that will help improve their quality of life. And then innovative construction, some new construction idea, something new, enhanced. Maybe doesn't have to be something huge like 3D printed. It could be something small, like just an improved method of getting something done. We are doing a lunch and learn type thing next week on the 29th. We'll make sure that everyone has a link to that. That one is open. Just want to make sure you can come to that. And with that, I think that's the end of my slide. So it looks like there's a lot of action in the chat. I haven't been able to look at that, but happy to open this up to questions. My email and phone number's here. Please reach out. Happy to come talk to you all. Anything we can do, please reach out. But thank you all very much, and see what questions we have.
Chris, thank you so much. Such a comprehensive report and overview, and I really appreciated, hearing what other jurisdictions are looking at, other states. That's helpful, and other employers, and then also to know what Virginia Housing's tackling. So it's exciting to see with the new grant resources that are like significant amounts, like maybe we can get some really innovative thinking and creative ideas on how we can partner with the business community to bring more housing. So I think what makes sense is we'll go ahead and try to address the questions in the chat if possible. Feel free to continue to add your questions there. And if we have time, we will, invite you to raise your hand to come off mute, but we're going to focus on the chat questions first. Again, I think, Chris or Bailey too, if you have any suggestions, you're welcome to kind of ask about that. So we did share the link to the report that Chris was referencing. So that is in the chat. We can put it back in for people who came in late that might not have seen it. But that's, it's a helpful resource if you want to do a deeper dive as well. So one of the questions was what it might require for the Commonwealth of Virginia to match the competitiveness of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I think that was around a housing bond bill. I don't know, Chris, if you know if there's any questions around the state issuing housing bond bills to kind of tackle this problem.
So I'm not sure specifically on what is being looked at for that. I will say Massachusetts has done some pretty creative things in the past where they had very specific goals for each, I think it's county in Massachusetts. I'm actually born and raised in Massachusetts, so I'm happy to brag about them a little bit. But they've done some really cool stuff where each county has a specific goal they have to meet each year in order to be able to access certain state funding. So that is something I think would be kind of cool to see, but I don't know for sure whether that's being addressed.
Great, thank you. And then you might have addressed this a little bit, but to what extent are the Youngkin administration and the state legislature actively supporting affordable housing efforts around Virginia as they try to attract new to business development? So I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, I talked about how we're working with VDP and DHCD very closely. Obviously, we all fall under the same Secretary of Commerce and Trade, and she is somebody who we have to send a report to make sure that we're updating them on what work we're doing in housing. They're very, very interested in this because they know that companies are struggling. There's one locality where we're meeting weekly at the request of the governor's office to talk about how we can address their housing concerns. So he's very, very involved and very understanding of this issue and knows that it is something that's holding everyone back. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of talk happening, and I know there are some bills going through General Assembly. I have not kept up as much as possible on that, but there's definitely some bills that they've pushed forward on both sides of the aisle on trying to increase housing and make it easier for everybody.
Great, thank you. I know many of us on this call are going to be involved with the fiscal year 2025 county budget and local and city budget formation. And of course, the state budget is in the process, it's still in formation. Do you, I guess, through your research, and you might have mentioned this, but just highlighting the most persuasive arguments that we can use or enticements to get our local leaders to support this work from the economic development side? I think as you mentioned, we're used to kind of talking about the human needs a lot of times, but maybe we're not as savvy as raising that economic development.
Right. I mean, if they're looking at their budgets of what they're spending on economic development, every county, every city is spending money on trying to recruit companies. They're putting money into this. They're trying to understand this. But if they're not thinking about where these people are going to live, that money is just kind of wasted. So working with your economic development partners in your region, I think working together, having one conversation and one message, a unified message, would be a great first step to make sure that, hey, they're trying to bring in X number of jobs. We need to supply X number of houses. How can we do that together?
Excellent. Great point. I think that's something we can all, those of us working on this can remember. So thank you. It's a good point. We don't typically reach out to that or even look at that part of the budget sometimes. How can we work with economic development to address the wage component of affordability? So basically, we know that wages have not kept up with the price growth, and there been any discussions about that with supply side initiatives? I don't know if that's a topic that was raised in the report or in your conversations.
So I think the only part that really brought up wages was with the construction workforce and how that needs to be increased and how that is an obstacle for a lot of people to develop more housing. As far as working with them, talking with them about what industries they're targeting. Every county, every city has certain target industries, whether it's data centers or manufacturing or distribution. Talking with them to make sure that what housing is being produced in your region actually matches that. If they're only building million-dollar homes, but they're attracting minimum wage jobs, that doesn't match. So this all goes back to just making sure you're having these conversations. It's really important to have a good understanding of what the targets are, what goals the economic development community has, and just making sure everything's aligned.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not an expert on this piece of it, but I do think just heard lately about some things DC has done, like someone was telling me that DC has required that all childcare workers have a college degree, which I think was a back-ended way to try to increase the pay in that industry, which with 2 kids in daycare, I am certainly sympathetic to, but ultimately what it's done is mean that people who have a background in childcare but don't have a college degree now can't work in the District of Columbia. And so I think Chris's point of how do you match the housing with the jobs that are arriving or that are here is maybe a better way to do that, rather than the other side of trying to force industries to pay certain wages that can then have like unintended consequences and ultimately end up potentially making the problem worse. I know the tipped wage stuff in DC and Montgomery County has had similar issues, and I've heard some restaurateurs on panels, saying this is going to have the sort of the opposite effect. And so it may be better to take an approach of how do we match the housing we're trying to create with the wages that are being supported by the industries that are coming.
Thank you. It's a great point. Okay, I'm going to keep going through the chat. I think we've answered some of these a little bit. Do you know, Chris, is the Commonwealth looking at where their surplus property located that could be considered? I know a lot of times that falls on our local governments, especially here in Northern Virginia, but is the Commonwealth putting together a
But
list?
there's been discussion about this. I think last year the General Assembly passed something where they were trying to do like a comprehensive database of where surplus land is and buildings. But I don't know if that was funded or what happened with that. I'm not sure where that one stands. But I mean, that is something that I think more localities need to do a deeper dive themselves and just be able to understand what is available and be able to advertise that to developers. Say like, hey, we have this land, we have this building. What can you do with it?
Great, thank you. So it's interesting. I think a point was made that the economic development professionals that you work with, their message on housing affordability is really a quality of life value versus then like an affordability or cost of housing issue. And that might be an opportunity for us to kind of incorporate this messaging as we talk about this with our local elected and state elected leaders about the kind of quality of life value that the housing affordability brings for all of us, frankly.
Right. I think that's something that no matter what your income level is, that's something people can relate to, what your quality of life is. People want to hear that. And then that also brings in like, okay, I'm going to go out to eat at this restaurant, but oh, that person needs a place to live too. Like it's just all about the messaging. And I think everyone on this call really understands and knows that. And it's just about making sure people hear what you're trying to say.
Yeah. Okay. So some questions about like Microsoft's program and ROI for their mezzanine financing. Not sure if there's other follow-up information that you have. I know you're just highlighting that program. Right. I'm sure there's maybe
in the full report there is some more examples and some deeper information. There's I think a link to their actual site that does all the requirements for that.
Great.
If not, let me know and I can get you that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess just following up on that, somebody had a question if those mezzanine debt, if they're subordinate to the local loans, to the local government loans that we all know and love here in Northern Virginia to make these projects happen.
I'm not sure how they have that structured.
Okay. Yeah, it might be in the report or the link. We'll show that. So question about really zoning changes, and Loudoun County obviously just underwent their zoning ordinance rewrite, and conversations around other municipalities doing or considering the same. I can add in that, Arlington just went through their expanded housing option, missing middle, zoning change, which was very, intense, rigorous debate in Arlington and somewhat controversial, but the county did pass it. I think there is a lawsuit pending that will be heard in July. And then the city of Alexandria also did their zoning for housing, housing for all, where they made some significant zoning changes around adding this to the supply of housing in general, and then affordable housing specifically. So we are seeing that. I think all of our local governments, Fairfax just went through the ZMOD zoning modification, looked at parking requirements. So I do think we are seeing a lot of that activity here in Northern Virginia, but happy to hear of any other examples.
Yeah, so I mean, Richmond, they got rid of their parking requirements for all new development recently. And other places are starting to look at this and trying to think of maybe a new zoning overlay district they can add to allow for manufactured housing or higher density. Anything you can think of, like, why not try it?
Great, thanks. Question about let me see. Any changes being considered for the QAP? So that's a qualified allocation plan that governs the low-income housing tax credit program, which is just used for rental housing. It's not used to build for sale housing. And I don't know if you know this, Chris, if there's money, will money be available for housing affordable to those living on 30% AMI who do not need wraparound services to make those more available?
So I am not a LIHTC expert by any means, so I will defer those questions.
I do think Virginia Housing is doing a deeper dive on the QAP next
They
year.
are working on that.
Yeah, so I think opportunities, and Navaja will share those with you all about opportunities to weigh in on changes to the QAP. Virginia Housing does a great job soliciting a lot of information and feedback before they make any changes. So stay tuned on
They
that.
will definitely our LIHTC team will be traveling around, doing their road shows, giving everyone a chance to weigh in and making sure that your voices are heard.
Yeah. So maybe you can clarify too, Chris, workforce housing is being 80% AMI, and if those, financing mechanisms or programs are different from what we consider more traditional affordable housing to support households between like 30 and 60% AMI. Have you been addressing both?
So they do kind of have to be addressed together. I will say for us, workforce housing starts at that 80% AMI for some of our rental financing programs. That's a number that seems to be effective. We're hitting people there. 80% and below, that's the people that we can talk about, that we hear, the teachers, firefighters, that population. As far as, what was the second half there? Sorry, what's that question?
Oh, just if there's, they're just targeting that lower AMI, and then also just noting the need for permanent supportive housing as well, just not losing that message of like serving the lower AMI.
Right. Yeah, that is definitely something we keep in consideration. We don't want to be taking away resources from our LIHTC program, obviously, or our permanent supportive housing partners, making sure that there are resources for everybody. So we're trying to work with different people, different groups around the Commonwealth to make sure that we're tapping into different funds and that there's enough resources out there where we're trying to help as many people as possible without taking from one bucket to put into another.
Great, thanks. So in Fairfax County, we've seen land being used for affordable housing that's from the county, FCPS, our public schools, and the Park Authority, but not so much from schools and the parks. So do you know if there's any examples of a more progressive use of public lands looking at parks and schools and other jurisdictions in the Commonwealth?
There's definitely examples of schools across the Commonwealth that have been adapted into housing, where they've used the fields in the back to build new construction, as well as doing adaptive reuse on the old structures. Parks, I don't know. I don't think that one might be a little bit harder to get across. People like their green space, and we think that's important. That plays with the quality of life. People want to have parks near them. So that one I don't know as any good examples. Down in Montgomery County, in Blacksburg, they took an old elementary school, converted it into senior housing, And then in the back, they built new multifamily. So that's one example. I know there's a couple different schools that are currently doing like feasibility studies on that we're helping with to try to get them to be developed and to add more housing into the stock.
Great, thanks. I also just want to highlight in the chat the link to Prince William County because they're also making significant zoning changes. They have a new comp plan they adopted a couple years ago and now are working on their ADU ordinance, which is really exciting, and have made some investments in a housing trust fund. So you can click on that link to share as well. Don't want to leave out our partners in Prince William for doing the great work. Just like 2 more questions, I think, and then we can be dismissed. But does Virginia Housing use a varied AMI target based on where the housing is being built? So I think the AMIs are, location based. I think it tends to be a broader area. So sometimes that's tricky, right? So all of our AMIs in Northern Virginia, I think, are that metropolitan statistical area, which doesn't always best reflect maybe the local rents, something to consider. But we do now have income averaging for the low income housing tax credit property. So we're seeing rents being priced at 30 up to 70% AMI. So that's addressing part of the issue. But yeah, it is I guess a challenge. And I don't know, Chris, if you have anything else to add to that, or Bailey.
I mean, yeah, we look at that regionally. Obviously it's not statewide. The AMI is very different across the Commonwealth. So making sure it's looking at that.
Yeah, great. And then is Virginia Housing investigating any alternative eligibility metrics to account for the mismatch between AMI and housing costs post-inflation?
Not that I'm aware of. I think if you have ideas of something like that, reach out to us. But I'm not personally aware of anything.
Great. Okay. Just want to take a second with 1 minute left to thank you all for the amazing robust Q&A. And I'm sorry we didn't get to answer your questions in person. Bailey, thank you so much for joining us from Buchanan Partners and the Navajo Board to help us frame this important conversation. Chris, thank you so much for all of your work to kind of make those critical connections between economic development and affordable housing in our Commonwealth, and especially here in Northern Virginia. Really grateful for you sharing that, study. I think you have the links. We will share the recording. We will share Chris's slides. Join us for our next Lunch and Learn. We do have a local budget advocacy session happening tonight. We're trying our first evening event to kind of capture more people who might not be able to join during the workday. So stay tuned, and really thanks again for the great conversation. Appreciate it.